The night train security cameras never captured what really happened in carriage 4. A 34-year-old Mafia boss boarded the last train out of Vienna without drawing a single eye. He expected darkness outside the windows, strangers keeping to themselves, silence all the way to Prague. Instead, he found a young woman sitting across the aisle, dark-haired, a bruise yellowing along her cheekbone, her sleeve pulled low over her forearm despite the warmth of the carriage. The man beside her was older, well-dressed, the kind of calm that only comes from never once being told no. She kept her eyes on the window. She never looked at the man across the aisle. Then, without turning her head, without making a sound, she released a folded piece of paper and let it fall into his lap. He opened it slowly, read the 6 words inside, and felt something shift in his chest that had not moved in years. What those 6 words set in motion would change everything, for her, for him, and for the man sitting so comfortably beside her. Lucien Vasko did not believe in accidents. He believed in patterns, in what a person did with their hands when they thought no one was watching, in the gap between what someone said and what their body quietly refused to agree with, in the kind of silence that had weight. At 34, he had learned to read a room the way a doctor reads a chart, fast, without feeling, looking only for what mattered. The night train out of Vienna moved through the dark with a low, steady hum. Passengers settled into seats. Some slept. Some stared at phones. A family near the back had a child who refused to be quiet. A businessman 2 rows up was on his 3rd drink. It was ordinary. Forgettable. Lucien moved through it like he moved through everything, without drawing attention. Dark coat. No tie. A signet ring on his right hand that nobody would look at twice. Nothing that said money, or power, or the kind of name that made men on the other end of a phone call sit up straighter. To anyone on that train, he was just a passenger. Quiet. Unremarkable. Heading somewhere that was his own business. He had been in Vienna 2 days for a meeting that required him to be physically present, to let certain men see his face and understand, without being told, what the alternative to agreement looked like. That kind of business couldn't be done through phones or messengers. Now it was done. He was heading back to Prague, back to the structure he had spent 15 years building in the dark, back to work that never fully stopped. He sat with nothing open in front of him. No book. No screen. Hands still on the table. Eyes moving across the carriage the way they always did, slowly, without urgency, the way a man scans a horizon not because he expects danger, but because the habit of watching had kept him alive long enough that stopping felt like a risk. He had boarded last. Not because he was late, because he was never in a hurry to be seen. He had stood at the far end of the Vienna platform, still, until the final boarding call and the last of the crowd thinned. Only then did he walk to the door. The carriage was already half empty when he arrived. 3 other passengers. The family near the connecting door. A man in a gray suit, briefcase open, eyes on his phone. Nobody looked up. Nobody ever did. The seat beside Lucien stayed empty, the way seats beside him had a habit of doing, not a conscious choice from anyone, just something felt without being understood. A quiet signal that the space was occupied in a way that had nothing to do with luggage. The conductor came through 20 minutes after departure. Scanned the ticket. Looked at Lucien's face once. Looked at the ticket again. Handed it back without a word. No question about the journey. No comment about the weather. Just the ticket, returned, and the conductor moving on with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided not to be curious. Lucien watched him go. Then his eyes drifted across the carriage, slow and habitual, and settled on the girl. She was young, dark-haired, slight, sitting across the aisle beside an older man who wore his expensive clothes the way comfortable men do, without thinking about them. Her sleeve was pulled down past her wrist, even though the carriage was warm. Her gaze was fixed on the window. She was perfectly, carefully still. Not the stillness of someone at rest. The stillness of someone who had learned, through practice, that small and quiet and unremarkable was its own kind of armor. To the rest of the carriage, there was nothing to see. An older man, serious-looking, gray at his temples. A younger woman beside him, his daughter, maybe, or his assistant. Someone he traveled with. He had bought her a coffee at the last stop, set it in front of her without asking, the way people do for someone familiar. She had wrapped both hands around the cup and said something quietly. He had smiled and returned to his phone. Ordinary. Forgettable. The most dangerous arrangement in the world. Lucien read the man first. 50, maybe 53. Comfortable in the way that came not just from money, but from years of never being challenged. His posture was relaxed, his movements unhurried. His hand rested on the armrest between himself and the girl, never on her, but always there, positioned in the narrow space between them. Present and claiming without being visible as either. Then he looked at the girl. The bruise along her left cheekbone had passed the worst of its color. It was in the flat yellow stage now. Old enough to be ordinary, recent enough to still matter. When the man beside her said something and she turned to answer, her response was immediate, controlled, mechanical, the response of someone who had learned that the answer was required, and the feeling behind it was no longer relevant. Her eyes went to his face and came straight back to the window. But in the half-second before they returned, they moved, across the carriage, the exits, the corridor door. A quick, practice sweep, almost invisible. Lucien caught it. He caught all of it. Because the truth of any situation never announced itself. It only waited for someone willing to look closely enough. He looked away. He had seen what he needed to see, and what he had seen sat in him like something with edges. It was 20 minutes later that the paper landed in his lap. He did not look up. He did not react. He let his hand move to it slowly, the way a hand moves to a phone left face down on a table, casual, unhurried, belonging to a man with nothing particular on his mind. He turned it over under the edge of the table, unfolded it with 2 fingers. Read it once. He is going to sell me. 6 words. Small, pressured handwriting. Each letter formed with the care of someone who understood they might only get one chance to write them. He refolded the note, pocketed it, and sat very still for 4 minutes. Not because he needed the time to decide. Because a decision made too fast in a moment like this was a decision made with feeling, and feeling was the one tool that had never once served him, well, anywhere that mattered. So he sat. He kept his eyes on the window. He breathed at the same pace he had been breathing since Vienna. And he thought, clearly, coldly, with the part of his mind that had been making irreversible decisions since he was 20 years old. He knew what the note meant. He had known the moment he read it. He had spent years learning how men like the one across the aisle operated, what they used, what they moved, how they made the evidence disappear before anyone thought to look. The girl had 3 days. Whatever was waiting for her at the end of this journey was not a hotel, not a job, not anything she had been told. He knew that the way he knew the weight of his own coat. He also knew that he was the only person on this train who could do anything about it. Not the conductor. Not the sleeping family. Not the businessman 4 rows up with his drink and his comfortable ignorance. Just Lucien. With the network he had built across 6 countries, with contacts who answered at any hour without asking why, with the specific capability to apply pressure in precisely the right place without making a sound the wrong people could hear. And he knew one more thing, the thing that settled it before the 4 minutes were even finished. Choosing not to act was still a choice. He had learned that long ago, and he had been carrying the weight of certain choices ever since. He did not need another one. He did not need to arrive in Prague and spend the rest of his life adding 6 words to the list of things he had decided not to read. But the real reason, the one underneath the logic, the one he would not examine directly while he was still on this train, had a name. Sonia. 17 years old. With dark hair she was always pushing out of her face, and a laugh that arrived before the joke was finished. The loud one. The quick one. The one who made rooms feel warmer, without trying. He had been 23 when she disappeared, still building what he was building, still learning what the world was made of beneath its surface. He had not been watching closely enough. That was the truth he had never said to anyone, not even to himself in the quiet dark of an empty room. He had not been watching, and the network that took her had been watching for exactly that. They moved fast, those networks, faster than he had at the time. By the time he understood what had happened, she was gone, Not missing the way people go missing by accident, but gone the way people go missing when someone has already decided where they are going. He had spent 4 years searching. For years, for countries, more dead ends than he could count. A trail that led to Bratislava, then Budapest, then a port city on the Adriatic coast where it simply stopped. Not because it ended. Because someone had made certain it could not be followed further. He never found her. He never stopped looking. There was still a man in Bucharest who sent a message every few months with nothing new to report, and Lucien still read every one. But the trail had been cold for 7 years. And in the years since, he had built a wall around what he suspected about where it ended, and had never once allowed himself to look directly at it, because some things, if examined too clearly, become permanent in a way that cannot be undone. The note in his coat pocket was 6 words. What it had opened was a door he had spent 11 years keeping bolted shut.
He stood.
Slowly, without urgency, the way a man stands when he is simply stretching his legs after a long sit. He buttoned his coat, moved toward the corridor without glancing at the girl or the man beside her, stepped through the connecting door into the cold and the noise of the track beneath him,
Took out his phone,
and began to dial. The language he spoke was not one Dražen Holic would understand. That was not an accident. The first call lasted 40 seconds. The man on the other end asked only what was necessary, and was given only what was necessary, and by the time Lucien ended it, something was already in motion in Prague that could not be undone. He made the second call. The third. Each one short. Each one in a different language. Each one landing with a different person in a different city, who began moving without needing anything explained. This was what 15 years built, if you built carefully. Not loyalty. Loyalty was a feeling, and feeling shifted. What Lucien had built was a system. People who understood that when he called, the information was accurate, the timeline was real, and the cost of doing nothing was something none of them wanted to calculate. The fourth call was different. He dialed a Prague number he had not used in a long time. A woman answered on the second ring. "I have a girl coming in on the night train," Lucien said. 19. "She needs somewhere safe tonight, and someone she can trust in the morning." "Condition," the woman said. Her name was Vera. Her voice was low and unhurried. The voice of someone who had absorbed a great deal of difficult information over many years and had decided, somewhere along the way, that panic was not a useful response to anything. Frightened. Physically intact. 11 weeks under his control.
A pause.
Not hesitation. Calculation. "I'll be at the platform." She ended the call before he did. Lucien had known Vera's name for 6 years. He had funded her work twice, indirectly, through channels that kept his name detached, not out of shame, but out of the practical understanding that his name attached to anything made it complicated. She had never asked where the money came from. He had never explained. He stood for a moment in the cold corridor, looking at the phone in his hand. He had never called her for a reason like this one. The fifth call went to a man named Doru. For words confirmed, he would be on the platform. The photograph Lucien had sent between calls was already received. The train moved through the dark. In the carriage behind him, a girl was sitting very still, waiting to find out whether the note had been a mistake or a lifeline. Lucien put his phone away, stood in the cold corridor 1 moment longer, then turned and walked back. 11 minutes after he returned to his seat, the file arrived. It came through an encrypted channel, 3 server reroutes, no sender name, no subject line. His Vienna contact had moved fast. He opened it and read, without changing his expression. Dražen Holic, 53 years old. Croatian national. 9 years resident in Vienna. On paper, he operated a legitimate import business. Kitchen equipment, commercial storage, the kind of ordinary cargo that crossed borders without drawing attention. The business was real enough to pass inspection. Registered address, small office. 2 employees who genuinely appeared to know nothing about the parts that mattered. It turned a modest profit each year. Just enough to be believable. That was the point. 3 prior incidents. No convictions. In 2 cases, witnesses had given initial statements and later provided different ones. The file noted this, without editorial. Lucien supplied the editorial himself. Witnesses didn't change their stories because they forgot. They changed them because someone had quietly explained the cost of remembering. The method Hollick used was simple because simple was harder to prove and easier to repeat. A job offer, hotel work, cleaning, restaurant service, anything that sounded like a real start to a girl in a small town with limited options. A contract on letterhead. An advance payment as proof of legitimacy. Then arrival and the swift, quiet removal of every document that confirmed she was a person with a country and a name and the legal right to leave. Debt materialized next for the travel, the accommodation, the advance structured so it could never quite be repaid. Mirela Kovarik had been recruited from a town in eastern Slovakia 6 months ago. She was not the first from that region. She was not the first from anywhere in the file. The buyer expecting her in 3 days had purchased through Hollick twice before, through the same channel, the same arrangement, with the same patience. Lucien set the phone face down on the table. Outside, the dark countryside offered nothing back. The stakes had never been unclear. But now they weren't just clear. They were absolute. Hollick left for the dining carriage at 20 minutes to Prague. Lucien had been watching for it. The shift in posture. The small adjustment of the jacket. The easy movement of a man who believed his evening was proceeding exactly as planned. Lucien waited 90 seconds. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, and followed. He did not go to the dining carriage. He stopped in the corridor between carriages and waited. When Hollick came back through with an unfinished drink and the unhurried expression of someone who had never once had to account for himself, he saw Lucien standing in the center of the corridor and slowed. Not stopped, slowed. The body registering something wrong before the mind had caught up. Lucien did not move, did not reach for anything. His expression did not change because it had not been anything in particular to begin with. "I only need 3 minutes," he said. In Croatian. Hollick went very still. What followed was not a threat. Lucien was precise about this. A threat was a negotiation, and he had not come to the corridor to negotiate. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is reading from a document already memorized, at the volume of a conversation about train schedules, without raising his voice once, without touching Hollick, without performing any of the physical gestures that men in corridors sometimes used when they wanted to feel more powerful than they already were. He told Hollick what the file contained, which copies existed and where, on which servers, in the hands of which people, in which cities. He named the buyer and explained that the buyer was, at this moment, having his own conversation with someone Lucien trusted to have it correctly. He described what the next 72 hours would look like if Hollick stepped off this train in Prague as planned, not in terms of violence, not in terms of anything dramatic, but in terms of the precise, methodical dismantling of every structure Hollick had spent 9 years assembling, starting with the import business and ending with the 2 employees who thought they knew nothing but would quickly discover how much they had seen. He said all of this calmly, quietly, without moving. Then he described the alternative. Mirela's passport and every document taken from her, right now, returned in this corridor. And Hollick would step off this train in Prague, board the next connection out, and permanently remove himself from this particular line of business. Not prison. Not violence. Just absence. Clean and permanent. The moment Hollick understood that the man in front of him was not angry was the moment he knew he had no leverage. Anger could be reasoned with, delayed, waited out. What was standing in that corridor was something far simpler, a man who had already made every necessary call and was now extending, out of indifference rather than generosity, one clean way out. Hollick's hand went to his jacket. He produced a passport, dark blue, worn at the corners. A folded identity document behind it. Then a phone, offered last, with the careful deliberateness of someone surrendering something they understood the value of. Lucien took all 3. "The next train after Prague," he said. "You'll be on it." Hollick said nothing. Lucien stepped aside. Hollick walked back toward the dining carriage with whatever story he was already building in his own head to make the corridor feel like something other than what it was. Praha Hlavní Nadraci at 11:40 at night held the particular emptiness of a large space that had recently been full, the echo still present in the cold air, the platform floor hard and bright under white overhead lights. The train released its passengers the way night trains always did, Stiffly, slowly, people blinking in the hard light and pulling coats tighter against the chill. Lucien stepped off and moved to the edge of the platform. Vera was already there. A woman in her 50s, dark practical coat, standing with the stillness of someone who had done this before and knew that stillness was less alarming to a frightened person than motion. Her face had the quality of someone who had received a great deal of difficult information over a long time and had not been broken by any of it. She saw Lucien. He gave the smallest possible movement of his head. She stayed where she was. Mirella came off the train 3 minutes later, moving carefully, each step considered, the same controlled smallness she had carried through the entire journey. Bag over one shoulder. Eyes not searching for Holic, not searching for anything. The flat, waiting calm of someone whose body had kept moving long after the mind had stopped making predictions about what came next. Lucien stepped into her path quietly, leaving enough space that she could stop without feeling cornered. She stopped. She looked at him directly for the first time, without the window between them and the performance of not looking. Her eyes were dark and very steady. Whatever she felt was not on the surface of her face. It was held somewhere deeper, by the same discipline that had kept her still across the aisle for hours. "The man you were traveling with will not be following you," Lucien said.
Low even.
"The woman 10 meters behind me, her name is Vera. She will take you somewhere safe tonight." He held out the passport and the folded identity document. She looked at them before she reached for them. When she did, she took them with both hands. She held them briefly against her chest, not dramatically, just the way a person holds something they had stopped believing they would ever see again. She did not cry. She did not ask how or why or who he was. She looked at him once more, one long, steady moment, and then she turned and walked toward Vera. Lucien watched them cross the platform together. The older woman and the girl, moving at the same pace, Vera's hand not quite touching her but close, available. He watched until they passed through the station doors and the doors closed, and the platform was just a platform again, cold concrete, white light, the smell of diesel and winter air. Then he turned and walked in the opposite direction. 3 months later, a postcard arrived. It came in a stack of correspondence his assistant had sorted and left without comment. It was at the bottom, small, the kind sold in tourist shops near bridges and old squares, the kind that cost almost nothing. The photograph on the front showed a bridge in Bratislava in afternoon light, the river flat and gray beneath it. He recognized the city before he turned it over. When he turned it over, he recognized the handwriting immediately. Small, pressured letters, each one formed with care. 7 words. Not 6 this time. "I'm home. Thank you for reading it. No return address." He had not expected one. He stood at his desk for a moment, holding it. Then he put it in the left interior pocket of his coat, against his chest, and went back to work. He did not frame it, did not mention it, did not put it anywhere it might become a story he was expected to tell. He carried it the way he carried other things, quietly, without making it more than it was, or allowing it to become less. When that coat wore out 8 months later, he moved the postcard to the next one. Now it was winter again, and he was on a train. Different city, different direction. The same dark window full of passing countryside. He sat alone, the seat beside him empty, the carriage settling into the late-hour quiet of passengers who had stopped pretending to be awake. He thought about Sonia. He allowed himself to do that sometimes. Not often, not for long, but honestly, without looking away from the parts that were hardest to see. He had not found her. He was never going to find her. The trail had been cold for 7 years, and cold trails did not warm, and he had learned, slowly, with great resistance, that carrying that truth was not the same thing as surrendering to it. It was simply what carrying it looked like. What he knew was this. On a train between Vienna and Prague, a 19-year-old girl had folded a piece of paper with 6 words on it and released it into the only gap she could find, trusting that whoever received it would be worth trusting. She had no way of knowing who he was. No reason to believe it would work. She did it anyway because the alternative was doing nothing, and she had decided, in whatever quiet, frightened place that decision was made, that doing nothing was no longer something she could afford. He had been the right stranger. Right carriage, right moment. Paying attention at the right time, for all the reasons that attention had cost him. He could not make that mean everything. He had tried in the weeks after Prague and found that it could not hold that much weight. But he would not let it mean nothing. He looked out the window. The dark moved past. He kept watching. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is pay attention. Lucien couldn't save his sister, but he saved someone else's. And Mirela couldn't shout for help, but she found one brave way to ask. There is a lesson in both of those things. If this story moved you, give it a like. It means more than you know. Drop a comment telling us what stayed with you. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Arden Tells Tales. We'll see you in the next one.